Hi, I'm Tom Stephenson and welcome to Lecture 2B, Cost Control in Construction. Today we're going to be following up on Lecture 2A where we looked at some of the principles of cost control. We'll talk a little bit about how cost accounts are used for tracking costs to give sort of a high-level view, understand the importance of documentation and its relation to controlling costs. And as I've mentioned at the start of this course, we'll be looking at a number of different tools and techniques that help to lead to success, mental models, if you will, and systems and processes that help to lead to successful management of construction projects. And in order to be successful in managing projects, we have to be able to control costs so we can meet our profit targets and be sustainable as a business. So today we'll be looking at the Pareto Principle. So we mentioned in lecture 2A that we would want to have a baseline budget. And of course the data, however it's formulated, we mentioned that there should be some sort of cost coding going on. We should have some breakdown of the work. We should have like a grouping of the cost, material, labor, equipment, admin, whatever that may be, that we want to monitor different items on. So in this case, we want to break down that we're monitoring footings, and we've broken it down into material and labor. And so we have our budgeted cost. We have, well, actually, I'll go from left to right, our cost code, our task description, so we understand what it is that we are actually monitoring. If we're doing it from a loading of a schedule, we can have that in alignment with each other. A grouping of the cost, budgeted cost, so that's your plan going into it, and that would have been derived from the estimate, but now it's broken down into particular items that you feel that's important for you to manage in the execution of the project. That's going to give you valuable information to be able to manage the execution. And the actual costs, well, what did it actually take? And so we have a budgeted cost, we have an actual cost. So what's the difference between the budgeted and actual cost? So that's the variance. And so what's the status? Are we at budget, under, over? So in this case, we're under budget. This case, we're over budget. So that's a negative. So how is that being shown? And then on these two items, on this particular item, we're $50 over budget. Same thing with the keyway, over budget by $50, under budget on the labor, because these can reverse each other depending what it is, and then under budget on that item. So if you had a whole bunch of items, or if you had a section, so remember we talked about work breakdown structure, and you wanted to see in this area of work, how are we doing? You could see a tally for that particular area, or you could see a tally for the whole project, depending on what level that you're looking at. And you should be able to see that as you're proceeding. So far on the project, we are X amount of dollars over. Where is that coming from? It's coming from these particular areas. So that would give you that data. So we're over budget overall. Here $50, over here we're under budget 173, so the difference between the 173 and the 150, that would be our 123, which should also be the same difference coming across here, right? So that's just looking at it, sort of a sample cost report, but of course it's going to be for the whole project. And you have to figure out, well, at what level of detail is this information useful for us? You know, you can go crazy at the level of detail, but it's not really worth it if it's not going to give you information that you can really actually take that information and then adjust what's going on in the project, right? And that you can actually manage the actual cost aspect of it. So it's got to be reasonable in what you're tracking to give you the information that's required. We also want to think about, so one of the areas, we mentioned labor and we mentioned material costs, and we'll be looking at labor in a lot more detail too. But when we think of material costs, we're purchasing from supply chains. Supply chains are all the suppliers or subcontractors or whatever it is that we have performing work on the project, and then of course they have people that they purchase from, and on and on and on. And that's what we call the supply chain. And of course, when we purchase from somebody, we should be assigning a PO. So if you're going to a supplier, there's a purchase order number so that you know when you get the bills from that supplier. Because if you're a contractor, maybe you've got a contract with Central Fairbank Lumber. Well, in a month, you might have had 300 pickups or 300 deliveries of materials from them. Well, you'd want to know each delivery, have it assigned a purchase order so you know for which project that is for. So then basically you'd want to be then assigning those costs to your project, and you want to be looking at the amounts that are coming off of those particular items. What areas of work are they being used for? So that you can track your costs and compare it to what your budget was. So we really develop these processes with our suppliers prior to the start of the purchasing process, right? And we have a strategy developed so that everybody is clear of understanding what types of documents and contracts will be required and what types of materials and services, and ensuring that we have a good PO system so that we know what this is being assigned to and which projects. Otherwise, all you're doing is you're seeing at the end of the year, did we make money or did we lose money as a business, right? You know how much money comes in, you know how much money goes out, and then you'd see the difference. That's fine, but you don't know which projects made money, which projects lost money. And then within projects, what part of the project made money, what part of the project lost money. So you can provide feedback also to your estimating department and your project team. And that's how the continuous improvement process cycles into running successful businesses. So some of the goals of material management, and we'll look at this in detail further in the course, but to ensure the right quantity and quality of materials is made available at their point of use when needed. Just a simple sentence. Ensure the right quantity and quality of materials is made available at their point of use when needed. If we get it, what happens if we get it there too soon? What happens if we get it there too late? You know, there's all these sort of spin-off effects that we'll get into this course. But just quickly, as an example, if it's there too soon, then it's in your way. Then it gets damaged. Then you're paying for it way in advance. Then it gets stolen. You know, just as a few examples there. But there's a lot of things to think about. So we also want to make sure that we have gotten the best price or reasonable price given the amount of time that we take to look for it, right? You know, there's a trade-off too between looking for the best price and how much cheaper is it. You know, you hear about people in their own lives. Yeah, I got this great deal on this flat screen TV. Yeah, I just had to drive up to Newmarket to get it, and I had to pick it up and bring it back. It was $30 cheaper than the other one. Well, if you drove up to Newmarket to get it and you drove it back, what's the value of your time? How much money did you spend in gas? What's the warranty on this? Is it as good as the warranty on somewhere else that was more expensive? You know, there's a bunch of factors that come into play. So at what point is it worth that savings, right? Well, same thing in construction projects too. But definitely on larger companies, they'll have a purchasing department that and we'll talk about that in the next few slides, the different way it may be set up, whether it's centralized or decentralized. Reduce inventory to the lowest amount of required. We definitely don't want to have more on a site than we need to, right? So this doesn't look like a very good site. Lots of waste there, stuff just piled up. It's going to be warping, twisting, cupping, checking, and generally just in the way of us functioning on the project, not to mention that it's a safety hazard, etc. So reduce inventory to the lowest amount required. When we talk about lean, that's a huge deal. Lean is all about having a continuous flow of work on the project. So that means you want to have materials delivered at the most responsible time. We'll get into that in another lecture. But the most responsible time is enough that it's there, that when the workers are there, they have it, but not so much in advance that it's in people's way. So there's this fine line, and different materials are different areas on the spectrum on this. assure quality requirements are maintained. Well, do we want to get it cheaper, but then it doesn't meet the requirements of the specifications just because it was a little bit cheaper? That's going to put us at risk. Minimize the cost of handling. Do we want to move it several times? No, we don't want to move it several times. We want to minimize that. So, and of course, we want to reduce damage and waste. So, material management, it's more than just purchasing and procurement. It's planning, it's the acquisition, it's the flow on the project, it's distribution. And it's making sure that we have the right amounts and that we are not wasting any more than necessary. So that we're not wasting any more than necessary. And construction has a lot of waste. Recent studies in the US, Scandinavia, this country suggest that up to 30% of construction is rework. Labor is used only at 40 to 60% the potential efficiency. So that's telling you that you've got somewhere between 40 and 60% of waste in that. Accidents account for 3 to 6% of project costs, not to mention the moral and ethical side of accidents. At least, now we're on materials right now, we'll be looking at the others in other lectures, 10% of materials are wasted. I would say that's a pretty good number there. The message is clear. If anything, I think it's low. There's plenty of scope for improving efficiency, quality, simply by taking waste out of the equation. Things like quality issues, and then you end up having to, like this, if you could actually see this picture that I took of a driveway doing one of my morning walks about 4 months ago. The slab was cracked everywhere. Like this picture doesn't even do justice to all the cracks that were in this particular slab. So of course after about 3 weeks, this was all being broken out again and being redone. So when we talk about waste, there's a lot of waste that goes on in construction. So when we think about some of the activities that impact material flow, well, the estimate, did we do it well? Are we short of some materials? Did we get way too many materials? Either way, you're going to have waste of trips back and forth, waste of delivery orders if you have extra deliveries than necessary. The scheduling and trying to make sure that materials are there when you need them, well, that's a big waste too. If you have workers waiting for work, if you don't have the materials there for the workers, they can't do the work, right? Or if, on the other side, if you have work waiting for workers. So there's this sort of catchphrase that's used in lean construction: work waiting for workers and workers waiting for work. Trying to have an even flow so that neither one is happening. Requisitioning, so we have to develop a system so that we can do our requisitions and get a purchase order for what we are going to order. So very often companies, internally you'll have to get a PO number before you place an order, so that PO number is assigned to that job, and what is that area of work materials being ordered for, so we can assign account codes to it. Purchasing, actually getting the materials, making the order, placing the order, expediting it, shipping the order, making sure that the actual order has been shipped, and receiving the order, making sure that what was ordered is actually been what's delivered, because when you sign off on it, you're saying that it's complete. And then if you need to store it for a period of time before it's actually being utilized. So as I said, and how long, and trying to make that as short a time as possible. So all of those things come into the material flow aspect. And different types of purchasing. You can have centralized purchasing that takes care of all of the purchasing. So that means you would have basically somebody that would be in charge of purchasing for the company. And that means they would build up relationships with all the suppliers, and that they would negotiate deals. And in some cases, they may negotiate that in a particular year that we are going to order at least X amount of cubic meters of concrete from you, but we expect this pricing. That gives that opportunity when it's centralized. That can be very helpful. And if you have checks and balances in place, you can ensure that the central purchasing, that there's less opportunity for corruption that may go on with a decentralized system. So that can be a real advantage in that way. So it's got the price advantage due to larger lots and orders and scaling that you can do. You can get preferential treatment because you can have certain suppliers that you're dealing with, so economies of scale. Move surplus across projects. So for if you've got too much on one project, you could have it basically shifted to another project. It might be a little bit more smooth that way. It helps to lessen vendor kickback temptations. So if it's on a project, you could have somebody that's corrupt on the project, that's placing orders, that's receiving money under the table from a supplier. That doesn't mean you couldn't have somebody in centralized purchasing doing that, but that could be more closely monitored. And reduce misplaced or lost purchases. You've got all the documentation in place. You've got one point of placement there. Decentralized. Well, decentralized basically means that you have at each project, they're making the orders, they're placing the orders directly with the suppliers. So they're phoning up that particular supplier and they're working out the delivery there. So you've got one less step in the process, right? So in this, you've got the project, they're basically getting the centralized purchasing to make the order. So I'm at project A, I need these materials and I need them by Thursday. You're telling that information to centralized purchasing. They're making the order with the supplier. And sometimes things get dropped in the translation. There might be questions or something wasn't communicated, like that this was needed by Wednesday and then they forgot that this is needed by Wednesday, etc. So you're talking more directly to the parties involved this way. So that can be a real advantage. Ordering material to be shipped to site has a fair amount of advantages. Better service in case of emergencies. You call direct, we need this. And then the relationship is built in that level. You might get a better response. Better relationship with the community because wherever the project is being located, you're making those purchases there as opposed to maybe more broadly. And the staff definitely has a clear handle on the needs and timing of the material requirements. And so, of course, when you have an extra step, when you have sort of maybe I've got that wrong when I said it, but when you have an extra step, this could get lost. Like this, maybe central purchasing has a whole pile of orders from all these different projects to make, and yours gets lost in the mix, and now you don't get what you needed on that day. But here you can make really sure that if you don't get it, you know why you didn't get it. That supplier didn't give it to you. So decentralized has that advantage. So it can be done a multitude of different ways. Larger companies will tend to usually like to have more centralization. They may have their company broken up into districts and then have it centralized within the district when they're big enough to do that. All right. Also with decentralized purchasing picking up materials, like it can be quicker. Like you're just going to send somebody to pick it up. You don't have to deal with purchasing, and that can be easier that way. But you want to limit how much stuff you're picking up, like that's not been delivered where possible, because that can be a waste unto itself. Not that you don't need to do it at times, but you don't want to make that sort of the way that you do things if possible, unless it's very small projects that then it makes sense for. So kind of when we talk about material procurement flow, how that kind of works, you get an idea of sort of the flow chart of things that go on. And this would be for larger projects, of course. I'm not talking about simple stuff, right? So you have your maintain shipper list, preliminary traffic study, acquire field input. So you're up here, right? So you acquire the field input, you make your requisition of what you need. If you've got multitudes, so if we've got centralized purchasing, that's the advantage. They can shop it. They have time to do that. Decentralized, not so much time to do that. So you can issue requests for proposals from vendors. Maybe it's things that you want to get together in an order, in a package, and you want to compare who's giving us the best price on this. And you'd have, of course, the typical vendors that you have accounts with, that you would be ordering from. As a larger company, you would have a multitude of various accounts set up with different vendors, which makes it easy for you to purchase from, and it also means that you don't have to pay them the second you get it. Once you get the material ordered, they'll be sending out, usually in a couple of weeks, their invoice for that month, and then you pay it. Receive vendor bids, review the vendor bids, see what makes sense. Preliminary traffic study, well, that just depends on what it is that's being delivered. Typically, that's not going to be coming into it. Analyze the bids, put conditions, what's the best one to go with, so reviewing it, analyzing it, and are there any kind of exclusions or conditions on the bids, and making sure that you've evaluated that, so you pick the best one, issue the PO, expedite any documents that the vendor may require, expedite the vendor orders. So basically, the order is now being shipped to the job. If this is having to be put together with the supplier, they're doing that. They ship it to the job. Of course, when you receive it at the job, you want to sign off on it. You want to make sure it's not damaged. You may want to make sure that you got the right quantity. Don't just sign for things without checking them. That's where you run into problems, because then the vendor says, we delivered it. You signed off on it. You say, no, I didn't receive it. All the items, this is missing. So you have the receipt at the job, and then that closes out the purchase order. And then, of course, the invoice will arrive in a few weeks. So that's sort of the flow chart that goes on with this. And you want to make sure that your paperwork is done, and that you, basically that you can ensure is done to ensure payment. So from the vendor's side, they're going to want to make sure that everything has been signed off for, and then that it's you've got the receipt for it, and then that way they can close it out and then bill for it. So when we think about controlling equipment costs on this particular topic off materials, looking at equipment costs, we want to make sure that we have some way of tracking rental equipment or equipment that we have. If there's a certain daily cost that we associate with the rental of that equipment or the use of that equipment, we want to track it, right? And so it's not just labor, it's also equipment costs that we would want to consider and we would want to track. When we're, and we'll look at that as well in details, but again, it's like labor costs. Equipment is a variable cost, right? So the longer the project takes using that equipment, the more it costs, the more the rental costs are associated with it. If it's labor, it's the same thing, right? I've got 5 people here. We plan to allocate it for 5 people to be here 5 days. We allocated for this backhoe or this bobcat to rent on this site for 5 days. Well, now if it's here 15 days, we're paying for it another extra 10 days. We'd also have the variable cost of whoever the operator is that's now taking that much longer as well. So that's something that we need to track, because we want to see how we're doing with our budget on those line items. Where are these extra costs coming from? If we don't know. We also, when we think about tracking costs, we can think about tracking cost and time. And usually a project kind of follows a S-curve with this. And we'll look at this a little bit further in the course too. So there's kind of an S-curve that's followed on our projects that usually starts off fairly slow, a project, as you're mobilizing. And then as you get into the project, there's more of a steady state of cash flow that is being spent on the project. And then towards the end, it tends to taper off because you're drawing to the end. And so people are being withdrawn from the project and you're just closing out and you're doing all the deficiencies and things. And so there's a definite S-curve that you can see. And then as the project is tracking, you can actually compare the planned S-curve to the actual S-curve to see, is there a variance in time? And indeed, this one's not showing it. Indeed, this one could be also coming up here and it could be going up and above, right? So this was the original cost budget, and now we're at 120%, and we're 25% over time, and we're 20% over budget, or 10% over budget, or whatever that correlation may end up being. But it's a good way of sort of visually seeing if this is starting to track differently, then that's starting to show you very early on in the project that there's a trend occurring. If you're actually monitoring a project pretty closely, you can do an earned value analysis. And what an earned value analysis is predicting the trend. We're 5 days behind at month 1, and we're $10,000 over budget. By the end of the project, we're going to be $150,000 over budget and 30 days behind, following this trend. So I may mention this, but Stein's law it comes up later in the course, but Stein's law is a very simple law. A trend will continue until it stops. Well, the idea is to see the trend starting and then make it stop. Act on it to make it stop. Doesn't mean that that's the way it has to go, right? But it does mean that that's the way it's trending too. So when we think about a track project, it can be on time and on budget. Very good. That's, we think about the different ways that when we're tracking a project. So it can be on time and on budget. Very good. It can be delayed and on budget. It could take extra time, but maybe there's a bunch of factors that you did on this project and you were still able to keep it on budget. Depends also on the relationship that you have with the client, whether this is okay or not. Usually not. Like clients, especially in the commercial sector, they want it when they want it, because if they don't get it, then they're losing revenues. If it's tenant fit outs and things of that nature, well, if it's not ready, then it's a problem. Or if it's got to be ready for a tenant to move in, and then they're going to do their own fit out. But if you don't get it ready at that point, then maybe they don't start paying rent because it's not ready. So that can be problematic with your relationship with the client. On a budget point of view, it could be delayed and on budget, not likely. Delayed and over budget, not good for anyone. Unfortunately, it's a very common zone of an unsuccessful project. You're behind schedule and you're over budget, right? So you're behind schedule and you're over budget. Delayed and under budget, right? You're delayed and you're under budget. I said on budget here, so you're actually on budget. Here, you're even actually saving money, even though it's taking longer. Well, very unlikely, like things are taking longer than you expected, or something maybe cut into the project and you had to wait. Maybe that's why it's under budget. So something client stopped you and then there was another period of time, but it didn't really cost you money for that delay. So maybe you were under budget. It is possible, but it's probably not that likely. Ahead of time and on budget. All right, so that's 2 thumbs up. Believe it or not, you can be too far ahead of schedule. You got this building done 3 months ahead of schedule, and the client doesn't want it till the finish date. So maybe you got to provide security, and your warranty's already started on this particular project because they're not assuming the project till a particular date. Depends on your contract. That's a case where it may not be good, but generally it's pretty good. Like, I just want to point out with some of these, you got to look at, well, what are all the variables that are involved. Generally, it's a pretty good position to be in, right? It's generally a pretty good position to be in. Ahead of time and over budget. Not great because you're over budget, right? But why are you so much ahead of time and you're over budget? It shouldn't be because of overtime, because why would you be doing a bunch of overtime if you had the time? So it shouldn't be for that reason. But maybe whatever thing, time-wise, something went really fast that knocked it off, but other things were, maybe there was one line item that was just a total mishap, or maybe there was a budget amount that was incorrect in the estimate that caused that problem, but you were able to execute on a timely fashion, but it still was over budget. Those can be some reasons for that. And ahead of time and under budget, right? So that's super. Again, as long as you're not too far that it's causing some sort of problem with the client. But it's way ahead of schedule and the client's happy to have it, that's even better. I always remember there's a senior vice president, Alice Don, that used to always tell me, he'd say, show me a project that's on time and I'll show you a project that's making money, right? So it's that correlation with time and money. By that he meant project that's on time that didn't require a pile of overtime to keep it on time. He just means one that was estimated well. There was a baseline. We've been measuring as going along. This is the time frame. This is the budget, and we're hitting our budget targets, and we're hitting our time targets as a result. That things are just flowing well the way we expected. It's been planned well from the beginning, and it's being executed well. That's really what he meant with that. Bruno Antidormi from Ellis Don used to say that all the time. So yeah, that's helpful from that perspective. So these are good points to think about, because when we're talking about cost control, these are really coming into play, and what are the impacts and why, and thinking about it in those terms, and thinking about the impacts that back to VUCA from 1B, how that can play in on that. So I did say I want to talk about, and in these lectures I'll try to have a tool of the week, shall we say. Last week it was VUCA. This week VUCA, and it was actually the Pomodoro timer as well that we talked about in lecture 1A. Being able to learn better and to sort of focus and use a Pomodoro timer. Today it's going to be Pareto's law, also referred to as the Pareto Principle or the 80-20 rule, sometimes the 20-80 rule. Goes by a number of different names. It really comes from the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, where he looked at pea pods and he looked at the relationship with them, but it was then noted that it actually made sense to so many different things in both the natural world and the business world. And so it was really brought to the forefront by J.M. Duran, one of the quality control gurus that really sort of brought out continuous improvement and lean manufacturing. They really sort of got that rolling in the 1950s. They were quality control experts, productivity experts, went to Japan, both J.M. Duran and Edwards Deming. The Toyota production system came out of the work that they did. And then, of course, we got Six Sigma, lean manufacturing, and lean construction. So they're all been influenced from those particular areas. And J.M. Duran noted what he called the trivial many and the vital few tasks. And he kind of corrected that later in life. Didn't mean that the trivial many weren't important, but they weren't as impactful on the success of the project as the vital few tasks. There's certain low-hanging fruit. 20% of the task will lead to success, and 20% of the tasks will lead to 80% of your results, would be one way of looking at it, right? So there's always these key parts of a project in the construction process, key points. Those would be the vital few. So the trivial many, vital few, often referred to as the critical few as well. Vital few might be better because it might not confuse it with the critical path so much. So vital few, trivial many. So you can think of this, and you've maybe if you've worked with me before, you've probably heard me say it enough times, but 20% of your clients make you 80% of your profit. You know, and again, this is a guideline, right? So it could be 20, it could be 10 and 90, it could be 30 and 70, but it's in that kind of zone. 20% of your clients take 80% of your time. 20% of your subs take 80% of your time. So these are for sures. I think I mentioned before that one of the big telecom companies in Canada at one point wanted to, they recognized this, and they looked at who are our 20% of customers that just drive us crazy with phone calls. They're never happy. Everything's always a problem. They're taking a lot of our time. We're sending out people to fix their things when there's nothing wrong. And they actually identified them and sent them a letter. Thank you very much, but we no longer want to serve you. So that worked pretty well until the government got involved and said, you can't do that. It's an oligopoly. There's only a few of you. You can't do that. But certainly construction businesses can typically do that. If there's a client you don't want to have, you could not use that client, right? I don't want to work with you anymore. That's it. Don't quote any projects for them if they're really, if you can't be profitable on their projects. Well, you know what? If you're carefully monitoring your projects, you'll see where your money is going and why you're losing the money, and then you can make those decisions much better because you would know why there's a problem here. 20% of your employees take 80% of your time. And again, it might be more, it shouldn't be that high, I would say, with employees, probably 10%. If it's that high, then you have other things that you need to look at, such as your hiring practices. You have to look at your training practices. You have to look at basically your retention practices. Why are you keeping such a large amount of employees that are problematic? And 20% of your investments contribute to 80% of your losses. 80% of your effort often leads to 20% of your results. 20% of your activities takes 80% of your time in planning and execution. So 80% of your clients will return to do business with you if you do really good work with them. Well, there's a key point. Now the one that I very often used, and this kind of ties to with VUCA, if there was complexity in some of the activities that I was working on with a project, I would usually try to identify what are those activities ahead of time. What are the parts of the components of this project that keep me up at night, that I can't go to sleep with? It's a good question even to ask subtrades in a meeting. What keeps you up at night? And then you get the feedback, and then you can work collaboratively to try to reduce that. But on any project, there's certain things that you think are technically complex. So that's giving you a flag. So now we are going to, if it's in the case of ambiguity, it's not clear, we can pilot it, we can test components of it. Or if it's something that is larger, we can put extra effort into that planning process. We can bring in better expertise so we can clarify some things. So we put extra effort into those areas, and going back to the chart, then that's going to lead to us being successful in this project. So if we're going to spend time on something, making sure it's going to flow well, it should be those particular items. An example would be, I can always remember on certain projects, my dad, when I was a kid, he'd be like discussing the structural steel. Got to do this well. If we get the structural steel in, this project's going to flow really well. He'd have something usually on each project that he'd really like, and then he'd make sure that that was really well planned and executed. And then all of a sudden you could see relief, because now it's in the wheelhouse. Now this is the level of complexity on this, it's a piece of cake. So it's going to be different on different projects, right? And if you're able to do that, that leads to more effective management, more effective time, less rework, helps to keep your costs and your budgets more in line on the project, right? So Pareto's law, I find, is a very, very useful tool for that, right? For those purposes. So Pareto Principle, 80-20 rule, you can apply it in all those different avenues and different ways, as I mentioned. And a few more points there. I think I've kind of covered that for you. There's even a whole book on it written by Richard Koch. I read it a few years back. You want to think about all the different ways and then how you can leverage that to your advantage, and that can help you lead to success. It's also part of lean thinking. As I said, it's from the foundations of the work of Duran and Deming, so you can be sure that that's foundational to lean thinking. We all have limited time on things, and so this helps us to prioritize our focus on things. It's nice for me to say everything's got to be perfect. We got to not waste one penny. We don't have time to do that. There's certain things that it's worth letting go of because it's not going to have that. It's not going to be that impactful on the project. It's in that 20% that's not that impactful, leading from the 80% of activities. And then if I'm acting on all those little pennies, it's not having as big an impact as if I made sure I really covered those 20% items really, really well. But as I said, Duran did say the trivial many, they're not that trivial. You can't forget about them. You got to manage them. But I think the structural steel story kind of hits it home. All right, so that's the tool of the week, if we will, with the Pareto Principle. And hopefully that over the weeks, these little tools and how they focus us in on this particular course. And as I said at the beginning, this course is very integrated into being successful at running projects. So it taps into a lot of particular areas. Particularly, I said that towards the end of Lecture 1B, where we had the mind map and we could see how all the interconnections take place. So I'm Tom Stephenson, wishing you a wonderful day, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.